Hello my friends, I recently made a video about how I scored in the 99th percentile on the GMAT Focus, and a ton of the comments on that video were questions about the verbal section. And lucky for us, I did really well in the verbal section on the GMAT Focus. In fact, I scored in the 100th percentile, which is literally the best you can do. Now, I don't say this to brag. I'm just saying it so that you know that the techniques that I'm going to share with you today in this video at least have some merit, as they're what helped me score so well. So without wasting any of your time, let's get into talking about how to ace the verbal section. The nice thing about the GMAT Focus Verbal Section is that unlike the original GMAT, we don't have to study sentence corrections. That means no more worrying about grammar, sentence structures, parallelism, or pronouns. The main two types of problems you'll face on the GMAT Focus are reading comprehension and critical reasoning problems. Reading comprehension problems are when there's a big block of text, usually a couple of paragraphs long, that talks about some historical event, biological phenomenon, technology, or business event. Usually the topics of these articles is pretty boring, but that's beside the point. For each of these texts, you'll be asked 3 to 4 questions about the text. The purpose of the reading comprehension on the GMAT is to test your real-world reasoning skills. They want to see how you handle making decisions, even if you don't have a ton of time going through that information. Oftentimes in business, we need to make good decisions, even though we haven't had an ideal amount of time to analyze all of the information. So what's the best way to approach these giant chunks of text? What I did was take 2 to 3 minutes to read the text before even looking at the questions. Now these are really dense readings, so it's more important that I understood where things were in the passage than memorizing everything that the passage said. The great thing is that the passage stays next to the question through all of the questions, so you can always refer back to it. On my scratch paper or whiteboard, I would write a super brief outline of the main points as I read. Let's take this passage as an example. It reads, "Recent scholarly investigations underscore the imperative to reconsider the prevalent prescription practices of hydrocodone by medical professionals." I pause. Okay, that's a lot of big words. I know the main concept here it's talking about is examining how often doctors prescribe this H drug, so I write it down. Examine how often doctors do something, but even if I don't know what hydrocodone is, that's okay, I just keep reading. Such research reveals that in the majority of instances in which an opioid could be used to treat pain, less addictive substances can be effectively used. Okay, I pause again. Now I know that we're talking about addictive painkillers, and it sounds like the author doesn't really think they're the best option. I jot down H drug, addictive, not great. Furthermore, empirical evidence is mounting with regard to the escalating prevalence of addiction in patients who use opioids. In these cases, the negative side effects of the intake of even minor dosages of these medical substances can lead to far more destructive outcomes than they were originally prescribed to treat. Okay, again, a lot of big words here, but what's the general idea? These opioids are addictive and dangerous, and the author thinks that other drugs could be used to do the same thing with less downside. Okay, again, the author thinks that we are overprescribing opioids, specifically hydrocodone. So now that I've got this little map drawn out that's way more simplified, I can go to the question, and if it asks me something like what the passage is primarily concerned with, I'll have already figured out it's about the over-administration of these drugs. Or if it asks me about a specific part of the passage, I can go back to my simplified map to figure out what part of the passage talks about that topic, so I don't have to reread the entire thing again. Now, you don't need to write every detail of the passage. In fact, you really shouldn't, because that would take way too much time. Instead, just the basic ideas to keep yourself oriented. Once you've done this and you're looking at the question, focus on eliminating the wrong answers until you find the right one. I personally like to write A, B, C, D, E on my paper and then cross them off as I go. Many reading comprehension passages will have an author arguing for or against something. In the reading we just read, the author was arguing for the idea that doctors should be more selective when they prescribe opioids because the benefits are minor while the negatives are fairly high. In this passage, everything follows that argument. But what if the author addresses the opinions that were opposing his argument? For example, he could discuss the reasons why doctors think they should prescribe hardcore painkillers more. Lots of times, authors will show the other perspectives like this and just not agree with it. But if we aren't careful with our map and we go to the question, it's pretty easy for the GMAT to give you an answer that is actually the opposite of what the author believes, but it agrees with the counterpoint that the author acknowledged in the paper, and then you click it and it's actually wrong. If this doesn't make sense, that's okay. Let's use an example. In the realm of economic discourse, few principles ignite as much debate as the concept of free trade. The unfettered exchange of goods and services across national borders cultivates economic efficiency, innovation, and consumer choice. This means that free trade allows countries to specialize in the production of goods and services for which they have a competitive advantage. thereby enhancing overall economic welfare. However, the principle of free trade is not without its detractors, who contend that while the benefits of free trade may be distributed globally, they are often unevenly allocated within nations, potentially exacerbating income inequality and leading to job losses in sectors exposed to international competition. Furthermore, detractors state that free trade can undermine local industries and cultures and allow multinational corporations to exploit weaker regulatory environments in pursuit of lower production costs. So, is the author for or against free trade? Even though the most recent thing we read was anti-free trade, the anti-position is not what the author thinks. It's what the detractors think. That may seem like a duh to some people, but when you're stressed and hurried in the test, it's very easy to mess this up. So it's important to keep your story straight with these little notes. It may take a bit more time at the beginning, but it will save you a ton of time by not having to go back and reread entire sections. As you're making these maps, you can abbreviate words, use arrows to show cause and effect, use EG or EX for example, use up and down arrows for increase or decrease, or use greater than, less than, and equal signs. As you get more comfortable with reading comprehension passages, you'll start to see some trends. The GMAT questions about these passages tend to fall into one of these two buckets, general and specific questions. An example of a general question is when it asks something like, what is the primary purpose of the third paragraph of the passage? In this case, you'll have to block out the other paragraphs in your mind because I promise you that one or two of the answer choices are going to be the primary purposes of paragraph 1 and 2, and if you're not careful, you'll select one of those. Again, this is why having that little map of the passage is so important, so you can remember the key point for each paragraph. The second bucket of questions are the specific questions. The three most common kinds of specific questions are detail questions, inference questions, and specific purpose questions. Detail questions are going to ask a specific question about something in the passage. They'll usually start with something like, according to the passage. So let's use this example. According to the passage, TARP reduced the impact of the 2008 financial crisis by... So we would have already read this passage, already had figured out our little map that said the passage talked about TARP in the second paragraph. We would then go to the second paragraph and see that TARP allocated $700 billion to purchase toxic assets from banks, which provided them with liquidity and helped restore confidence in the banking system. The correct answer would have had some kind of information about this. Now, I apologize for not having better practice questions that we can use because I can't share the content of the actual GMAT question book without breaking copyright laws, laws, so I'm doing my best to write my own practice questions. If you get the official guide practice book, you'll be able to apply these principles to a ton of real practice problems. Now, on to the inference questions. If you remember only one thing from this video, remember this. The GMAT does not use the word inference like we use it in our day-to-day lives. To see what I mean, take this example. Let's say that you're at work and your manager comes up to you and tells you to be on your best behavior because Quantum Leap Technologies executives are coming into the office to meet with your CEO today, and they are your company's most important customer. Now, if I ask you to make an inference on this in the real world, you might say that Quantum Leap is the biggest customer of your firm, but that's not right according to the GMAT. For an inference to be correct on the GMAT, it's not enough that it could be true, it must be true. So in this case, they could be your biggest client, but they could also be considering purchasing your company. Their CEO might be pals with your CEO, or they might be about to ink a deal to buy a ton of products from you. They don't have to be your biggest client. So if we're going to make a GMAT inference, what could we infer from this story? Well, we can infer that someone from Quantum Leap is meeting in person with your CEO, or that you have other clients because you at least have to have one other for Quantum Leap to be the most important. But in this case, with the info that we're given, there really isn't a ton else that we can positively infer. But with most inference questions, you're going to have more information than this. So how do you know if you're faced with an inference question? Well, there's usually a word like infer, imply, or suggest in the question stem. One way to prevent the GMAT from tricking you into choosing a real-world inference answer in the question options versus picking the correct GMAT inference answer is to theorize what things you can infer from the point of the passage before you look at the question answers. Inference questions in reading comprehension can be tough, and there are also inference questions in the critical reasoning section. So, if you're struggling with the inference questions in reading comprehension, practicing the critical reasoning inference questions can help you focus on the skill of inferring without all of the junk of the passage around it. Inference questions can be really hard for people, so let me know in the comments below if you'd like a video with in-depth examples for inference questions, and if enough people comment on that, I'll make one. The last main specific question is the specific purpose question. Now, these aren't as common as the previous two questions, but they still show up occasionally. Essentially, the specific purpose question asks you why the author included a piece of information. So let's say that somebody is talking about how great of an athlete he or she is, and they list their 40-yard dash time and their mile time. The GMAT could ask you why the author included the times for those athletic endeavors, and you would probably select something like, to set quantitative marks for how good of an athlete he is, or something like that. All of these questions can also be given as an accept question. Accept questions make you find the one wrong answer while all the other answers are right. This isn't much harder than traditional ones, it's just good to not be freaked out by it when you see it. So let's say if the question says something like, all of these are tools the Federal Reserve uses to manage the money supply in the US, except you'd read reserve requirements, the discount rate, passing laws, and open market operations, and cross off A, B, and D, because those are all ways that the Fed does control interest rates. And the right answer would be passing laws, because they don't do that. Okay, so I know that's a lot, but that's the groundwork of reading comprehension. Now, if you're wanting to learn how to correctly answer the critical reasoning questions, be sure to click on one of these videos if it's after the first week, and if it's during the first week, just click that subscribe button because that'll be coming out next week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.